Hello, again this is Professor Kim Nelson with the Jewelry Design Department at the Fashion Institute of Technology. This is a third installment on a tutorial to show you how to render metal and stone, particularly cabochon and hopefully some pearl, using gouache. The media I'm demonstrating in is actually digital media, but the techniques are the same. We'll try and, when I'm working with metal, go back and forth between yellow and white. And when I do color stone, we'll try and use a few different colors to show how it would work. These tutorials are being compiled for the course JD 134. I am going to start this tutorial with the cabochon stones. Actually, I'm going to continue with our metal. I think that will make more sense and be more cohesive. So I am going to now paint a free-form object, a dimensional sculptural object. This is a Freesia Pin. I will paint it in yellow. As with the simpler studies, I will begin by knocking in the entire piece in yellow ochre or middle tint. I'm using a fairly vigorously sized brush here, not being too concerned about my edges, but I am shying away from tighter areas that I know this brush won't fit in. Of course, digitally I scale the brush with a slider. Using gouache, your brush size is determined by the pressure on the brush and how you orient it. If you lift the brush high up so it's just floating on its very tip, or if you allow the brush to come down and start using the side of the tool. Okay. I've done about as much as I can safely do with that big of a brush. The reason that we lay in the whole piece with a medium value, there are a couple of reasons, a few reasons. One of the reasons is so that you can get a design sense. You can get a feeling for what the overall positive and negative space of your design is. Positive space being these areas of yellow, negative space being the areas of white that it captures or that surround it, to get a better feeling of what your design looks like. Another reason is so that you start with a richer color so that you have a richer rendering when you're finished. If you started off filling in with a lighter, less threatening color, for lack of a better word, pardon me, you would end up with a washed out rendering in the end. Okay, now I'm going to come in with my medium darks. When you're doing a sculptural object, you're doing an actual relief sort of piece like this, not only do you use your medium dark initially to start to define the darker side of the piece and to discern form. For example, we know these are cones. These flowers are in essence cones or flutes, like a wine goblet. So we know that they are going to shade. The light's coming from here. As they tuck in, they're going to shade. And then we know that on the outside of them, it'll shade on this side. Concept of low-hanging fruit is important when doing something like this. There are a number of elements of the form on something as sophisticated as what I am painting now that are not going to be immediately obvious as to how you should handle the form. Okay? When that happens, you just start painting with what you know. Things that you know are right. You know there will be a shadow here because here comes the light. You know there will be a shadow here. You know there's a shadow in here. You know there's a shadow in here because it's diagonally opposed to where the light source is coming from. Okay? You know that this is the back side of this petal. So either there's going to be shadow under here, or there's going to be shadow on the other side of it. Now, if the light was coming up, this would be light, that would be shadow, but it isn't. The light is coming from as always, from the upper left. So this is actually going to be cast in a bit of shadow. What I was starting to say earlier is that as well as defining the form, when we start in with our medium dark here, we're also going to establish levels within the design. This petal is in front of that flower. This petal is in front of that petal. This petal overlaps here, overlaps this one. Now, these may not be where the shadow would actually fall with the light falling, from the direction the light is falling, but you are still going to put a line of shade to help make the piece dimensional. When you know that it does play in the way the light falls, like across this petal here, then you're going to make that shading more deliberate. You're going to make it follow. If the light's coming straight down, this shadow would be equal all the way along the bottom. If the light were coming from here, the shadow would be more prominent over here. The light coming as it does from the upper left, the shading is going to be more prominent in the lower right. We know that this petal reaches out over the rest of the stem here, of the flower, so we know that this is going to be shaded to some extent. And then we want to now give some form to the individual petals. And we don't have any information here telling us exactly how to do that. We're going to sculpt with our brush. This petal, I'm going to assume the light's coming in. It's a somewhat shaded petal because it's not directly in the light, but it's going to be more shaded here. I've decided. And as you paint, you will decide. Light's coming in. I'm going to put a little shadow here. And then I'm going to visualize this catching a lot of light. And then shading as it goes over. This one. I'm going to visualize that there's a slight cleft in this petal. And that this side kind of tucks more under and this side catches more light. Here, I'm going to visualize that this side of the petal rolls over. And I'm going to picture that there's, once again, a slight cleft in the leaf that the shadow is going to come up into. Here, shading from this leaf due to an overlap. Maybe something here. This petal, I want to give it a roundness. I don't want it to feel like they're made of paper. You know, you don't want the petals to feel overly thin. So if you apply a rolling shadow along the edge of them, you create dimensionality within each petal. And you don't put a rolling shadow everywhere. Where there's a highlight, you will put essentially a rolling highlight. I see this as being quite domed as it folds over. So I'm going to give it a shaded crescent as though it were a dome. This petal is going to have a little shadow coming up from here, but then the light's going to catch it. I see it that way. And I see a bit of shadow coming in here. This petal, once again, I see the light bouncing over here. So I see this side of it shaded a little. This petal, light's coming in, catch here. Not going to do a lot with that one. This petal, this edge would be dark. It would be more shaded, I believe. Although making it that dark isn't working for me. So I'll put a little shadow here. This whole bay would be somewhat shaded. I'm thinking. I might change my mind later. Most of the little dashes and lines I'm putting in now are just to roll off edges so that things don't feel like they're cut of paper. If I have a pipe or a tube like this stem and I don't know what to do with this value, I'll run a shadow right down the middle of it. That's one of the things I'll do. There are several ways I might handle that, but that's one of them. The key is I will treat it in some way that gives it more interest. Okay, so that would be my medium shadow. Now coming to my medium light, same thing. I'm sculpting. I see that being light. I see this being light. This is kind of in shadow. That's in light. This is being caught with some light under here. Not so much there, but a bit more here. And yeah, I'll put some light on that. Here, I feel some light there, and the majority of the light here. And I will actually use that to eat away some of that shadow that I put in before. You can change your mind. It's one of the beauties of gouache. It is opaque, so it will cover. This is light. And this is some light. This has light. Light and light. 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 Wasn't terribly sure what to do with this one, so I'm letting it talk to me. As I finish out the flower, I'll get a sense of what it needs and I'll add it. I want to get a sense of a slight divot, so I will leave a bit of a crease of shadow right there. For now. I may change my mind on that. Okay, coming down into here. I'm going to start picking up some light around here. I want some light to come onto this petal as well. Under here, putting that all into shadow was a pretty bold move. I'm going to let a little bit of light filter in through here. This I'm still seeing as a nice domed form. So I'll do that with it. Coming down onto here, this gets more straightforward. This is basically cylindrical. It's conical, but kind of conical / cylindrical. A domed surface. A domed going on cylindrical surface. Same here. I implied a bit of a dent in it with that shadow, and I like that. I'm going to keep that for now. I may soften it. I feel the light up on here. I feel it resuming here. Once again, a kind of a soft dent being implied. I want to pick up this little lip of flower in here. Sculpting along as I go. Okay. Now, the stems. Where I haven't put shadow in the middle of a confused area, I'll now put medium light. I'm activating it. I'm making it sparkle and bounce a little. Okay? This is confusing because these are the same value, and one of these is above and one of those is below, and I have to decide which one. And I can do that by adding more shadow. I'll go that route a little bit here. But I can also do it by adding some light along here. Okay. Core shadows. Where they're needed, where I feel like I need some real punch. Where a shadow needs to be strengthened to clarify some of the overlapping that's happening. As we normally would on a dome surface, as it approaches towards the lighter side of that shadow. Here, I put the shadow against this petal instead of this one because it's closer. When two objects overlap, the one that's the closest is going to cast the darkest shadow. I'm not even going to bother with these little stamens until I've pretty much finished the rendering. And then I'll come in and decide how to handle them. If I'm working in gouache, which you guys are, be careful not to lose the lines. If you are laying down paint and those start to disappear, take some neutral tint and a little burnt umber, so for a nice warm dark tone, and carefully with your brush reestablish them. You can reestablish them with your pencil as well. Just don't lose them. Or lose them and repaint them later, if you're feeling confident. That's also fine. With beginning students, I emphasize holding on to your drawing because it's kind of a life raft. But in reality, when you're working professionally, you draw as much with the brush as you do with your pencil, so you don't care so much if you lose the drawing. You'll just make it up in the paint. This I'm not caring for, and I'll go in and change it later. This needs more interesting stuff going on. This feels like a rolled, like the edge of a piece of paper, which we don't have in metal. So I'm going to imply a slightly rolled edge right there. Core shadows along these cylindrical aspects. Under here, in there, here, here, there, there. It's important once in a while to soften your gaze, get a little distance from your piece, get a sense of what's reading and what isn't. Highlight. Here. There. What you might be noticing, hopefully, is that every petal has almost every value on it. That allows every petal to be very sculptural, to have a lot of form, to not be flat. If you identify or develop part of your rendering, part of the sculptural detail with just a couple of values, that's okay, and I do that on occasion. But understand that when you do it, what you're doing, you are flattening it. You are bringing less attention to it, most certainly. And as I'm doing this, it will become increasingly clear where I've been confident and where I have not been confident. Places where I've known pretty much exactly what I've wanted to do, and areas where I'm still feeling my way around to see what I think I want to do. See, I'm using that highlight to roll that edge. I don't want anything to feel like a knife edge. A crisp line. I've decided not to put a highlight right there. I thought about it, decided against it. These little shapes that I am making, it's important that they be attractive when I'm done with them. So as I'm painting along, what I put down in a very sketchy, sometimes hesitating, sometimes overly bold fashion, I will, as I'm coming back in now, make pretty. Okay. So, my basic 5 values. Now I need to clean it up, solve problems, and I'll do that flower by flower. In here, it's very bland and plain, and I do not mind that. It's fine to leave areas bland and plain. I want to put a little value in between the dark I had there and the light. Soften that a little bit. That's okay what's happening in here. I'm all right with that. I'm going to come into this petal, which is still really vague. And with something in between my middle highlight and the yellow ochre base, just put a little bit of light in there. And this is coming in and it's getting really vague in here as it does so. And that's all right. What I'll often do if I have something like that happening, I'll put in a small light or highlight. This is actually all right with me. I don't mind that. That's fine. This is a big clump of dark that I'm not really thrilled with. So I'm going to go back in with my yellow ochre. I'm going to break it up, although those brush strokes are too large. And I don't like the direction I used either. Put a little line here, a dot of highlight there. Yeah, that's okay. Soften that edge a little. Here it's just kind of messy. There's nothing really going on over there. I don't intend to make this a big statement, but the edge is not lovely. Now what I'm going to do here before I go any further with individual flowers is I'm going to put in my reflected lights. Those will go a long ways. Remember, reflected light you always put on the shadow side and sometimes on the highlight side as well. Because those reflected lights are another level of detail, and you need them in order to have this feeling of bold reflection. So they need to be put in, and you shouldn't start adding extra, oh, let's make it look nice and fancy highlights and details until you've finished with your basics, and your reflected light is one of your basics. Of course, if I find areas to use it in a non-reflected light capacity, I will do so. And not all the reflected lights can be this bold, so I'm being selective about where I use them. Okay, for some of the less intense reflected lights, I'll go with my medium light, which is the taxi cab yellow with a bit of Pro Light. Actually, this particular one could use a bolder highlight there. Just looking around to see if there are particularly dead places in my rendering that a reflected light treatment would satisfy. Okay, I think that's good. Now I'll go back up into this region where I had broken away to do my reflected lights. Okay, this petal, shadow's going too far in. Once I trim that back, there's room to add more of my middle light. This petal's actually kind of nice. It's working. The shaded areas, a bit of a highlight. Okay, this flower. This is really kind of heavy-handed the way I handled the medium shadow here. I'm going to come back into it and back it up a little. I mean, I want it to still be shaded. That's important to the form, but it doesn't need to be so shaded. When it's really intensely shaded, it implies that there's a huge difference in angle between these two sides of the leaf, and there really isn't. It's subtle, so I want to keep it subtle. Lose it is an illustration term, where there are places where it actually becomes a little bit flattened. Where the form seems kind of shared between the two sides, but still keeping that form in place. Really what I'm trying to do now, guys, is just make it pretty. That's my emphasis right now. Adding detail where it needs detail. If I see things that aren't pretty, this is really dark and unpleasant. This whole area is too dark and unpleasant. So I'm going to soften the dark that I put into here at the beginning of the rendering. Do a bit of a rewind. And I'm going to bring this up in value. Cheer it up. Bring some highlight or reflected light color at least into it. Okay. Now I have that form back. I can decide how dark, if I still want to go dark. I'm going to go down in here maybe. But I find that a prettier solution to that petal. If I painted the same petal tomorrow, I would paint it different. It's the way it is. It's not, oh, it's a recipe, I paint every petal the same. I'm doing a little painting here. Whatever it feels like it needs is what I'm doing as I go along. Has to do with my mood, has to do with what I'm seeing today that I may not see on another day. Every day your eyes are a little different. You're going to pick up on different things. Which is a good thing. Yeah, it's nice to not have every day be the same. It's nice not to have every rendering look alike. And sometimes you'll go, wow, I really got that. I really pinned that down. And other times you'll go, not so much. And that's okay. You're not a machine. If I'm not a machine, you're not a machine. If my renderings vary, so will yours. Of course, we always hope the ones that we're doing as part of a tutorial turn out nice. There's a little permanence involved in that. Okay. Looking back up into here, is there anything I'm really unhappy with? This is also really dark. So I'm going to bring some light down in there. Going to expand on this highlight region a little bit. That's nicer. Now it's kind of boring up in here. Play with imposing a divot. No, don't care for that. Just a little bit of shade through there. Okay, I can live with that. This core shadow that I've put into here doesn't really serve a purpose, and it's not really helping the form, so I'll kick that back. This isn't great looking here, so I'll kick that back a little. This is really non-committal in here, guys. I've got all kinds of stuff going on where it's clear that I didn't really know what I want to do in here. So, come back in, clean that up into a single color or two, and then in a bold and confident way, if I want to put shading up in this, I will take a look, see what I think it needs, and add it and stop. Okay, those are the main flowers. Now I'm going to come down into here. This is really high and bright for being behind everything. So I'm going to kick it back. I'll go so far as the core shadow color, which is the burnt umber and neutral tint. Okay. On that as well. That's a very bold thing to do, what I just did, but it helps me to see what I'm going to have to do. I'm going to paint out that highlight altogether. Use a little of this color to put some light back in here. See, when I'm painting fast, I painted these all the same as if they were... I treated this as if it were any of the larger flowers, but since it really is in the background, it can't be given that kind of emphasis. So the lightest highlight it's going to have is going to be the reflected light color, your two yellows mixed together with a little pro white, and that's it. Yeah, that reads better. Okay. I'm okay with this. Fairly alright with that. Okay. That's good enough, I believe. This is hard to look at. It's hard to see because I've left it kind of undeveloped because I need to paint these little stamens in. To paint my little stamens in, I'm actually going to paint them quite dark. If I were using a paintbrush and gouache, I would actually go with a medium dark to almost core shadow value. There was one there too. Paint them in and then come back into that dark color with a fine pointed brush and bring out my detail. Okay. Take a last minute look around at the whole thing. I had left this very shaded in an effort to kind of accent that little statement there, but it's not working that great. Question how dark I've made this. But see, I have to also know when to stop, guys. I can play with this thing for hours. You don't want to watch me play with it for hours, and no client wants to pay me to play with it for hours. But I did feel that was fighting the whole rendering. I've actually ended up painting it right back down to the middle gray. If you ever have to paint something out, that's what you take it to. You take it to middle gray. Back to start. And then make your same choices that you made initially. Middle shadow. Now I'm feeling maybe just here. Medium light. Since I do want this to be the shaded side, I won't use much of that. Maybe that much. And that's okay. That does feel nicer to me. I have a really boring stretch of dark right here, which a single brush stroke will alleviate. Okay? That's done. He says as he comes in and adds another highlight. Okay, done. Leave it alone. Leave it alone. All right. Now I'm going to paint the torus surrounding the large center stone. I'm going to paint this in white metal. Starting with a middle gray. The reason I was hesitating when I was going to do whether I was going to do the cabs or continue with the metal, I was hesitating because I normally paint the stones first and then the metal around them. That way because you're going to be glazing stones, you know, at the end, and keeping those glazes from touching the surrounding paint is hard. So it's usually best to paint your stones first and then paint your mounting around the stones. But I felt like if I went to stones then came back to metal, it might become too confusing. I'm trying to think what I want to do with those two spheres. There's a couple of ways I could treat those. I'm going to do them two-tone. So I'm actually going to cheat, guys. I'm going to use yellow metal on here. Okay. Going to my medium shadows. Going to define each one of these ribs, these fluted for the braid. Each one has a shadow and highlight side. Treat each one like its own little form. When I have a bezel, since I'm going to have highlights here and here, traditionally when you do a bezel, I'm going to put a middle shadow, opposing, like this, in the yellow spheres. There will be those nice crescents that we always make on a sphere. Okay. Now what I didn't get done on the white metal is a cast shadow. This bezel will cast a shadow on that side. Okay. Light. Once again, the light side of each one of these flutes. Ribs. The light side. The light quadrants or corners of the bezel. And on the yellow, are somewhat of a paisley form, much of which is going to be occluded by the, some of which will be occluded by the bezel. And it's become obvious to me that I forgot to put the cast shadow on the bezels. I mean on the spheres, sorry. Painting and talking. It's a challenge. Alright. So, the form is starting to already read. You can tell that's a braided wire. You can tell that there are two spherical terminals on it. Core shadows. In the shaded area, close up to where the light is. You notice that the shadow is here, here, and then as it wraps around, it starts to go more along the side of each one of these, until as you come around the corner, it goes back to being down in the corner, down on the edge here. Okay, I'm going to apply a little bit darker cast shadow down in that very corner. I'm going to put a little bit of core shadow on the bezel. And that's good. Core shadow on the yellow. We'll be high up into the shaded area. Highlight. Since I've already got yellow on my brush, nice predictable round highlights. You're going to put this highlight right where you feel the roundest portion, the highest portion of this is going to be to the light. It's going to reach out the most to the light source. And on the bezel. Okay. Now reflected light. Remember, you can add hints of that reflected light also on the light side. And on the yellow. A larger brush stroke. Oh, that's why. Wrong color. There we go. All right. So we've now thumped in the basic form. That feels like it's metal. You can see that it's two-tone metal. You can see the basic form. It's actually a relief when I get a job like a braided piece of rope, because they are braided wire, because it's easy to pull off. This is basically done. I can add a little more detail, and I will, but I don't have to add much. It's really cleaning it up, looking for areas that don't look particularly nice, or that are kind of dull and boring. But there's not a lot to be done. Since they're little wires and you've given each little wire already a nice treatment, there's not a lot left to be done. The bezel actually is going to require more work than the braided wire at the end of the day here. You're going to need to bring a highlight along the edge here. Highlight achieves the same thing that the shadow achieves down in the shaded area, and that is it separates it from the braided wire. It's an important trick to have in your box, because otherwise you have to make sure you paint everything on the bezel lighter than everything on the braided wire because it's higher up, and that gets very difficult to do. It also ends up not being very attractive. It's easier to delineate those two with a bit of shadow and a bit of highlight. Okay, now our spheres need work. They're alright. But I can certainly play with them more than I have. Decide if I like that or not. Yeah, not great. If I were in gouache, I would have to. That would have been a more serious choice to make. Secondary highlights. Yes, that's working better. Something circular coming in from that side. Break this up a bit. Not that much. I mean, you want to have a circular feeling to everything you do, but you don't want a bullseye. You don't want predictable conical, boom, 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 circles going in, because it's boring. Metal doesn't ever do that. Metal's never really boring to look at. Fade in some of this shadow here. See what I think of that. Well, actually, I'll leave it, because what I would do with paint is what I'm going to do here, and that is I'll just come in with a slightly darker color. That's better. A little too much core shadow going on. Now there's not enough, so bring it back. I'm going to actually insert a little core shadow over here and not like it. To me, these spheres are looking kind of pasty. Okay. Put a shadow here where the collet overreaches it. Put a good strong core shadow from the bezel. Some actual highlight color in the reflected light, because it is a ball. It will get a strong reflected light. And maybe some auxiliary highlights. Okay, I can play with that ad nauseum, but I'm going to quit. That's enough. You know what they are. You can see them. They make sense. Alright, now I'm going to paint this form in yellow. I have to look at it first and decide what it is I'm looking at. Are these negative spaces? Are they? No, they're not, because this would be too thin. So this is all solid. I know the designer on these pieces, but he drew them probably 10 years ago, so I don't remember exactly the projects anymore. I picked them because they were kind of convoluted and complicated, and therefore made a good representation of how to handle a media. Filling it in with the medium yellow. Digitally, I would often fill in the stone as well. I wouldn't bother painting around the stone. But in gouache, the colors underneath affect the colors on top. So if there was yellow underneath there and I tried to paint a sapphire, I'd end up with an emerald. It would end up green, and not a very pretty green at that. And the white metal will be even worse, having a medium cold gray that you're trying to paint stone on top of is not an easy prospect. And I've actually realized that I can make that negative space. Those little teardrops could actually be pierced all the way through. I'm wondering if I would like that better. So I'll find out. Yes, I think that adds some interest to the piece. I think that's worth doing. Okay. Basic coat in. Now it's for the medium dark. I'm going to delineate this as rounded wire. Didn't have to be. I could have decided it was flat with the stroke of a brush. Okay. These are going to be flat ribbons that go around. Going to cast some or place some shaded faces where they would be to start explaining to my eye what's in front and what's in back. The reason I did that before trying to play with the ribbon surfaces is those ribbon surfaces, I'm not really sure how I'm going to paint them. I'm thinking. And while I'm thinking, I'm going to add more dimension to my rendering because that'll help me come up with a decision. Okay. I see them as portions of a cylinder. They will have a slightly rolled edge, but not much. Okay. The bezel, once again. The darker areas are here. All right. Medium lights. Do the wires first. Notice how this wire is shaded here from the light, and then as it comes around, it's shaded here. It is useful when you have a repeating kind of form. Like I have ribbons in this and wire. I paint all the wire together, and I paint all of the ribbon together. It's so I can keep my mindset, I can keep my approach clear to myself as to how I'm creating that form. Okay, and now the ribbon. And I have a hard line drawn, so the rolled edge can only be on the outside. the design calls for a hard, crisp edge where that line has been drawn. Okay. Now, in here, on these interior faces where I believe the light is going to catch a little, I will indicate that as well. Okay. Basic form. Now I'm going to add core shadows. Once again, going with my wire first. Okay. Now, for the cast shadow portions where I think that would be applicable. Okay. Maybe here. Let's see, I may have to take that back later. Now on the ribbon. Okay. Highlight. First on the wire. Not really loving that one. Leave that alone for now. Okay. In the shaded areas, there shouldn't really be a lot of opportunity to use the highlight color. There and there would be about it. On the ribbons, I'm trying not to do each one the same, dot, 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 dot. I'm trying to introduce some variation. Okay. My reflected light. Mixture of the two yellows with pro white. Do my wires first. Applying a little to the outer edge of those highlights as well. Okay. Not a lot of reflected light going on in the shadow, of course, but there are places where the color, even as just a flick of a highlight, could be helpful. This is going to need to be lit up a little bit. So is this. So I'm not going to really go in and play with them right now. I'll address them later. Now on the ribbons, reflected light is really only going to be applicable on the rolled edge, at least as far as defining form. Once again, this color can be useful for other things, will be useful for other things, but for establishing the form, the only place for the reflected light on this would be this rolled outside edge of each ribbon. Okay. So, problems. I have my basic form. It reads. It's working. But there are some problems. This dark area, some of the dark areas and the shaded areas, which I had darkened intentionally to show clear form, have ended up being too dark, too heavy. So I will take a minute and relieve some of that. Okay. And where there is still kind of a large area, but I don't want to go in and change the form much, I'm going to add some highlights. I'll use the highlights, some light, little sparkles of light, little dots. And to do the color I'll use to do that will be the reflected light color. That would be a nice spot for one. That works here too. Okay, it just puts something in there. Now, I need to do a nice crisp highlight along the sharp corners on my ribbons. Where that sharp highlight is actually true, as far as it really orients with the light source, I'll make it even bolder. I'm putting it everywhere where there is that edge, because it helps to delineate things. But like here, where it really is part of the story of how the light hits the piece, I'll be more bold with it. Here, where it doesn't, more conservative. And here it does again. Light would hit it right there. Okay. I've noticed that I missed some reflected light here. And then there are these little shaded divots, for lack of a better name. And I will hit them with that reflected light color. Just a little gleam. So they show up. I don't care for this. Care for that even less. I kind of like the point of shadow it's creating. I don't like what the light was doing. It's one of those things where you thought you had something really clever when you first painted it, and then as you look at it, you go, hey, it's really not reading. And it just turned it flat, and I don't want it flat. It's a wire. Okay, I'll let that stand. It's not ideal, but I'll let it stand. The bezel. I should have used my medium light back when I was laying that in on the rest of the piece. All those ribbons and wires got my attention. Okay, highlight. This is pretty boring, these big dark areas. So I'll add some kind of interest to them. Not in the same way on both sides, because that would be predictable and dull. Okay, now I need to bring my highlight, just as we did in the white metal, around the outside of my piece, outside of the bezel. It's the most precision line on here, and it's important. And I didn't do this on the white metal. I will go back and add it. You have to also do that on this lip over here, where it actually presses up against the stone, because this lip is where the light will catch. So be a highlight there as well. I'll bring that over here. Okay. Might as well clean the edges a bit where it's really obvious. Once again, in gouache, you would only do this at the end of your rendering. You do it with an X-Acto knife and just scrape paint that's inside where the stone's going to be. You obviously aren't going to scrape. You're going to paint it over with the appropriate stone color. Because otherwise, when you try and paint the stone color, it won't work. It'll be roughened paper and it'll affect your painting. Just noticing on the white metal here, I wanted it to increase some of the bounce of light around the reflected sides. Okay. All right. So there is the large flower and the two frames. Clean up my flower a little bit. The last one I'm going to do on this installment is that ring with the gypsy set stone. I'm going to paint that in white metal. So laying in the base color. Staying clear of the stone because I'm pretending I'm in gouache here. Okay, base color in. Okay, doing my middle gray, my dark, we'll just call it the dark areas. Shadow cast by the dome here. Since this is a dome, it will have that crescent. Bit of cast shadow here. Bit of cast shadow here. Okay. Now for the light areas. Most of the areas surrounding the stone. The shoulder of the shank. Deciding whether I want to connect those two. If I connect them, it indicates this is a smooth transition. If I don't connect them, it means there's a slight bump. I look at the way it's drawn over here, it looks smooth. So I'll connect them. Okay. Can already start to feel the basic form of that ring. Core shadow. And the only other place I would put that core would be Cast shadow. Highlight. Highlight is going to be over in here. And it's going to be right there. It'll also be on the far side of that stone a little bit. Okay, my reflected light. Also going to bring some reflected light up around the highlight edge, the lid edge of the ring. Okay. Oh, and some highlight. I'm sorry, the highlight would definitely be down here. A splash of highlight. Okay, so that's the basic form of that ring. There are areas that aren't working great, and I will address those now. The transition from here around the top is a little rough. I'm going to put a little bit of a highlight there. Same thing here. Transition that a little nicer. Now here, how I handle that is going to affect the form tremendously. If I bring white or light down into here too much, it's going to turn that flat. So I'm going to bring about a single stroke. I'm leaving that shadowed line there because it adds interest. It doesn't hurt the form. Here, this shadowed pocket is too strong. So I've painted it out. I've painted it out too far, of course. I'll have to come back and restore some of it. But a lot of times when you're coming into something, guys, and it's not looking right, the solution is to paint it out. Because if you try and see what you need to see around all of the reflections and things you've got going, it becomes very difficult. Very difficult to tell what's going on. So here's that little reflected light highlight there. This big dark shadow, big dark core shadow, needs to be broken up. That'll do it. Just that much. I want to bring in a little bit of light here. That's plenty. This is now bringing in light into the dark and dark into the light, kind of what we've talked about with our more simpler things in class. It's the same principle here. I want to have a dark accent line. I feel the need for a dark accent line on that dome. And what that's going to look like is, see, of course, I can just undo each time I don't like it. You guys have a... Okay, it's not working, so I'll leave it. little accent line there. Down in here, don't care for the second one. And a bit of dark. Up in here, this just dark black, it's okay. It isn't great. Going to break it up with a single dash of light. Now, the white on that ring shank, I am going to carry around, just like I did on the bevel, on the bezels. Sorry. For the same reason, the light actually will do that, so it's authentic. But it also helps to delineate what's happening here. Also, because I've put a couple of tiny little tight brush strokes in there, the whole thing looks more finished. The whole thing looks more complete. It's a trick. This is a gypsy set stone, so there would certainly be a highlight all the way around the rim on the right, and there would actually be a slight shadow all the way around on this side. Okay, I could do more interesting things in here. This is kind of boring right in here. Something like that would be nice. Not quite so light. A better shape. Fine. Okay. I'm reasonably happy with this. I want to bring a little more light up the shoulder here. Okay, calling that good. A little bright highlight here. A little bright highlight there. And there. Done. Okay, guys. I'll keep painting as long as I keep talking, so I'm going to shut up. That's a pretty good representation of rendering a technique applied to things beyond the simple form. I'm going to do our next installment on this tutorial. We'll deal with stone materials. Okay? Thanks a lot for your time. And I'll send the second installment as soon as I have it complete. Thanks.